Hi, today our guest is Karam Nachar. Karam Nachar is a lecturer at Işık University and also the general manager of Al Cumhuriye Collective, an online media platform. Today we chose the title of our program as Syria since 2011, and I'm sure our followers know that we have been closely following what has been happening in Syria since 2011. I mean, of course, it's not only us, but the whole world has been watching it. But, I mean, in general and normally, the reporting on Syria is confined to the actuality, and we tend to forget how these uprisings started in the very beginning and how it's evolved and how the involvement of different actors has transformed it. So today, and I mean, by no means a 30-minute program is sufficient to discuss all these subjects, but today with Kerem, we will try to do our best to refresh the memory of our followers and discuss what has happened in Syria since 2011. So, hello, Kerem.
Hi.
Really nice to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to start with the beginning of uprisings and go back to 2011. Can you tell us the sociological background of the people who went to streets to protest in 2011? I mean, who did go to streets and who didn't?
Yeah, it's almost hard, like given all the horrors that happened in Syria and all over the world since 2011, to actually look back and try to reimagine what happened back in March of 2011, 6 years ago. Basically, there was really, it's hard to imagine this moment of revolutionary hope, of like popular mobilization, popular empowerment. The Syrian revolution, we shouldn't forget, happened on the heels of 5 other preceding revolutions. This is the Arab Spring that everyone has now almost completely forgotten. We had the Tunisian revolution, the Egyptian revolution, the Libyan revolution, the Yemeni revolution, and of course the Bahraini revolution, which also couldn't really accomplish what it wanted to. And so basically the Syrians were basically empowered by the sense of hope that was sweeping through the Arab world. Things started at the beginning in the southern parts of the country as a result of a particular confrontation between the locals of Daraa, the city of Daraa, and the provinces around there on the borders between Syria and Jordan. It basically was confronted with brutal force by the Syrian regime and by the Syrian intelligence, the Syrian security forces. That led to further mobilization. Things sort of went out of control, and they snowballed into a nationwide mobilization. Local coordination committees were formed all over the country. People started going out in demonstrations. People started documenting these demonstrations on video and sending them to international media. And people also started on the social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, in close circles to discuss politics, to discuss possibility of change, to see what would the future Syria, a post-dictatorship Syria would look like. Now, at the beginning, in terms of the sociological background, one could say that there are 2 different levels that we could talk about. There's a popular level, and in terms of the popular level, the revolution was by and large rooted in the Syrian countryside, and particularly the Syrian Muslim Sunni countryside. So majoritarian Syrian Muslim countryside. But on the elite level, it was very diverse in terms of the intellectuals, the activists, and especially in the cities. So in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Homs, in the big cities, there was wide following for the revolution from all different walks of life and different social backgrounds. But obviously, there was the sense that the upper bourgeoisie in Aleppo and Damascus was against it, and
both Sunni and Alawi upper bourgeoisie, right?
Absolutely. So in terms of the sectarian divide, there was the sense that the majority of the people who were enthusiastic about change were not the minorities, in terms of the rank and file, in terms of the bulk of the masses that were going out in the streets, on the one hand. And in class terms, there was the sense that the haute bourgeoisie or the urban upper bourgeoisie of Aleppo and Damascus was also against the change, against toppling the regime, against things moving forward.
And what were the main political demands of people? I mean, I'm sure it's not possible to say there was like one political demand. Different groups had different political demands, I guess. But if you now look back, like what were the main political demands mobilized by different groups?
It actually, and this is one of the things that, you know, a lot of people accuse the Syrian revolution of having been a conspiracy against the Syrian, like an international plot against the stability of Syria. But one of the most telling examples why it actually wasn't is that if you look at the very early weeks of mobilization, the demands were very moderate, or one could say humble in terms of like what the expectations were. People at the beginning wanted, the earliest slogans were dignity. The Syrian people should have their dignity. They should not be insulted or humiliated by the security forces. People asked for reform. People asked for better governance. But then, because they were treated, or they were responded to with brutal force, this is basically quickly escalated into the people want the fall of the regime, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, which was the canonical slogan that basically echoed from Tunisia and Egypt and the different other Arab countries that witnessed the revolution. So it was regime change in the sense that we don't want the Assads to be in power anymore. We want a democracy. We want people to be able to go and vote in elections for their own governors, for their own leaders, and obviously behind that there was this sense of like people want their dignity back. People want to assert their sovereignty, the popular sovereignty over the public sphere, and to assert the ability to choose who they want as politicians or leaders or people in power. And people wanted to be respected in the public sphere.
It was a common theme in all Arab uprisings.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the Syrian revolution in the first year was referred to as Thawrat al-Karama, the revolution of dignity. So dignity was a very, very important value in those early days.
And how already existing political parties were represented in these uprisings or protests?
Yeah, it's really hard. I guess, you know, even for a country like Turkey, which hasn't had like a perfect record in terms of democracy, I think it's still hard for people here to imagine what a country under 40 or 50 years of authoritarian rule would look like in terms of pre-existing political parties and movements, because there were no movements. I mean, the word movement sort of presupposes mass following, people involved in specific political parties, people on the left, people that are Islamists, people that are in the middle. None of that existed. I come from a family that was very heavily involved in political dissent against the Assad regime in the decade before the revolution, and most people in my circle thought that we were completely crazy. We were nuts to be involved in politics, because, you know, if you talk about politics, you're most likely to disappear in Syria. You're just taken to a very scary prison, and you'll never be heard of ever again for 40 years. And so there was no real political movement, any political movement. There were very small leftist, elitist groups that were involved in opposition. They sort of came together under what it's called the Damascus Declaration in the few years before the revolution, from 2000 up until 2005. Basically, you know, multiple parties, but each party would probably have like around 100 or 150 actual active members. You had a lot of intellectuals, writers, directors, actors, who would, you know, come up with certain statements or manifestos to call for change or call for democracy. And you had very small local actors on the ground. And even those actors did not really know about each other back then, because people could not really communicate. There was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, and people were absolutely scared. It's only after, in 2011, when people actually did start talking to each other. Oh, you guys were active also in Aleppo. Oh, we were active in Damascus. We were trying to do something small in Daraya. This is the sort of like networks that were sort of mushrooming and that sort of pre-existed, but were not really in touch with one another, and definitely did not have any sort of mass dimension to their work. Now, how were they represented? They were, in terms of like most of the people, most of the parties that opposed Assad, most, not all, wanted to actually be involved. But they did not provide any sense of leadership, in my opinion. Rather, they wanted just to be included in what was happening. In the earliest days of the revolution, much like what happened in Egypt, I think, and even in Tunisia, the momentum did not lie with the political elites, but rather with the people on the ground, with the local coordination committees in particular that were mushrooming all over the country. People my age or your age or a little older who were assuming responsibility and trying to put things together. And we're just sort of like trying to keep the political elites informed if they wanted to, but not actually following their lead, if that makes sense.
I see.
Yeah.
And can you explain a bit more how the regime responded to the initial uprisings? What was Assad regime's response to all these mobilizations?
Death and more death, to be honest. And this is the biggest tragedy. I mean, because I really think that if we had had a different response in the first 6 months, then things would have developed radically differently, in my opinion. The regime believed from day one that this is something that they could have completely suppress. They could end it through the security solution, which is in Arabic we say al-hal al-amni, the security apparatus solution, not the political solution. Basically, you could just take hundreds and thousands of people to prisons. You can start infiltrating networks so that you can prevent any real sense of mobilization or protests taking place. And obviously, you can use live ammunition against protesters. And this is one of the most important differences between the Syrian revolution and, for instance, the peaceful revolutions of Egypt and Tunisia, for instance, but a similarity with the Libyan one. You know, the regime, the people in power were willing to use force with peaceful protesters from the very beginning. And already in the first 6 months of the revolution, we had more than 10,000 people dead as a result of, you know, the use of live ammunition against peaceful demonstrators.
That was something I wanted to ask because, I mean, we've seen in Tunisia and Egypt, like as you say, all these uprisings are somehow like connected to each other and created a momentum that affected each other. But in Syria, we have seen that the uprisings turning into an armed conflict. But in Tunisia, in Egypt, we didn't see such a trajectory. So what do you think are the main like political and social conditions that led the transformation of Syrian uprising to an armed conflict?
Right. I think the key factor here is that the military in Tunisia and Egypt was not willing to get involved in basically killing civilians in the streets. And because there was no willingness on the part of the military, the army, to get involved in mass killings on the streets, the civilian wing of the ruling elite had to capitulate and basically leave things to the army. And this is why in Tunisia, for instance, the army was willing then to give things back to the post-revolutionary political elites. And whereas in Egypt, it actually remained sort of in control. It gave power a little bit for a couple of years, and then it basically took it back. In Syria, that did not happen. The army was very much willing. The military was very much involved and willing to comply with the orders to get involved in the conflict and start shooting at people. Now, why is that? I mean, one could probably write a thesis on this, and it's a complex question, but I think this question of sectarian difference and solidarity is key here. In Tunisia and Egypt, I think the development of the state was such that it was an actual state vis-a-vis society. And so in a sense that the army had some sort of a certain integrity to it that was somewhat independent of the identity of the civilians in power. Whereas in Syria, the state in general, whether it's the military or the civilian, had evolved over the last 40 years to have become one thing. I mean, the military is not some sort of an independent institution which has some sort of power independent of the the ruling family, the Assad ruling family. And the fact that Hafiz al-Assad made sure from the early 70s, in fact from the late 60s onwards, making sure that the people who were in power in the military as well as in the security forces, which also are formidable in terms of the military power that they have, were by and large from the same confessional community, and reinforce within this community that there's only one option for these people to protect themselves, which is to defend Assad. Mm-hmm. And so this meant that for now, I'm talking obviously here about the Alawite community, mm-hmm. which in fact, and I think in terms of proportions, is the biggest loser in this conflict, because they've sacrificed so many of their young people fighting in this war against the revolutionaries, obviously, and then later the different military factions representing the opposition, to protect the regime, to protect the Assad family. And that's primarily because they feel that this is, because obviously the sense of that confessional solidarity, confessional loyalty, and also the sense that, without Assad in power, then, there will be retribution for everything that has happened under Assad Senior and Assad Junior over the last 40 years. Mm-hmm. So I think this is one of the key factors, the sense of sectarian division and sectarian solidarity that meant, and the way obviously the state had evolved under Assad to embody those sectarian identities, that meant that the army was always going to side with the regime, and that meant people had to respond. Ultimately, people were going out in the streets, and there was this resilience in terms of the peaceful stage. There was this Egyptian/Tunisian, I used to call it the Tahrir Square moment, mm-hmm. Where people for months were working towards attempting to have a Tahrir Square moment in Damascus or Aleppo. But, we sort of had it. In Hama and in Homs, we had hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating, chanting peacefully. And then, what happened? The tanks were rolled in. This is already, we're talking July, August 2011. And so from that point onwards, people felt, they had to take things into their own hands, and they had to fight back.
Mm-hmm. And after the initiation of the armed conflict, what were who were the main actors and sides? How the fact that arms started, different groups managing to getting arms, how it transformed the uprisings and the demands of groups of people who went to streets for, a year ago. Right.
So basically, we also tend to talk about the armed phase of the conflict as mm-hmm. one monolithic whole, but even that armed phase had its own stages, has its own historical mm-hmm. Development. We obviously had before that the peaceful protests phase, the Tahrir Square moment, throughout most of 2011. The Free Syrian Army was founded at the end of July 2011. Mm-hmm. From October onwards, there's actual clashes on the ground, and then obviously by 2012, February 2012, we had the Battle of Homs, in Bab Amr, and that was one of the biggest military moments of the conflict. But back then, one could easily say that throughout the first year of the armed conflict, 2012, and even up into mid-2013, the people fighting are by and large the same people who had protested, obviously in the Syrian countryside and in the poorer neighborhoods of the cities where there was the biggest mobilization, mm-hmm. like for instance in Homs, like for instance in Midan in Damascus, and other neighborhoods in the Ghouta in the eastern and western suburbs of Damascus. So it was very much of a popular armed resistance mm-hmm. that did not have any sort of clear ideological identity. Mm-hmm. By and large, it was a I don't like the word moderate because it always assumes that these people are of the same kind of the extremists. They just differ in degree. Actually, they're completely two different things. People who are Syrian, people who were heavily involved in the peaceful protesting phase, and people who decided that this had to become an armed resistance. Mm-hmm. And back then I was very heavily involved. I wasn't in Syria, but I was following it very closely. I know people who were involved in it. I know people from all walks of life who fought. I know people who were just like you and me with degrees from the West and who decided to go back and basically either fight, and this is not usually talked about, or document the fighting in support of the Free Syrian Army. Back then, the Free Syrian Army was real, not in the sense that it was a body of people, organized, structured, but in the sense that it was where the loyalties of people ultimately lied, in the sense that there was the Syrian project. People want to get rid of Assad, and they feel that the sort of regime that the Assads have built cannot be toppled without an armed war, like an armed conflict. And so this is how it evolved in the beginning. Now, obviously, once you get arms involved, you need money to buy those arms, which means that gives leverage for the people who have money, and the people who have money have their own agendas. And so already by the end of 2012, we hear of different stories where private backers, particularly from the Gulf monarchies, but back then it was primarily private families, wealthy people who wanted to support the Syrian revolution. People felt, but they felt more confident giving money to battalions and groups that had some sort of an Islamic identity. And back then, I know very well, I was in Beirut in 2013, 2014, but especially in 2013, where I've talked to a lot of people from Homs and Daraya and Daraa, where people, would come together and they would form a brigade, to fight. And they would look for a sponsor. And then they would come up with a name for the brigade that they just formed, or the battalion that they just formed. And they would pick a name such as, for instance, the Brigade of the Martyrs of Homs. Okay? And then, they would hear that someone in Kuwait or someone in Qatar or someone, I don't know, in Saudi Arabia. And I don't want to vilify those countries in particular, but I'm not saying that they had some sort of a plot. But back then, this is how it sort of evolved. A lot of people were interested there to give money. And they would say, yeah, okay, we'll give money, but this name sounds too, neutral. Like, how about they would come up with different names for more Islamic names. And that led to sort of like an Islamization, a pragmatic Islamization of the Free Syrian Army, where the names of the battalions started becoming more and more Islamic. People wanted to adopt a more and more Islamic look so that they would convince the people to give them money. Now, this is the second phase. So the Free Syrian Army, then the slow Islamization of the entire Free Syrian Army, or of the most of the battalions. But then we had something different, where besides that, we had groups that were not actually part of the Free Syrian Army. A lot of these people, especially in terms of the leadership, were not even heavily involved in the protest movement itself. Some of them were prisoners in the prisons of Assad and other prisons in 2011, 2012. Some of those people were released from prison by Assad, by the regime. And then they assumed quickly, leading positions in a different kind of armed groups, the groups that from the very beginning had a very clearly pronounced Salafist identity. Perhaps the most striking example would be Ahrar al-Sham, which is still one of the biggest fighting groups in northern western Syria, in Idlib, and also even Jaysh al-Islam, which back then was Liwa al-Islam, I think, in the eastern suburbs of Ghouta, by Zahran Alloush. Those people, the leaders, were not involved in the protest movement back in 2011. They were prisoners, they were in prison. And they were released later, and they had already had some sort of Salafist Islamic political involvement before 2011. They quickly mobilized after getting released, and they formed these groups. They had no problem getting money for these groups, and soon by 2013, 2014, these groups become a formidable force to the right of the Free Syrian Army, which continue to exist and continue to be the main force, but increasingly the groups such as Ahrar al-Sham and Jaysh al-Islam and these groups became as powerful. Now, the fourth phase would be that Nusra, so Al-Qaeda infiltrated. You probably wanted to.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask. Like, we've seen after one point the involvement of transnational jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and also ISIS,
right?
And how this transformed the conflict, and how their presence in Syria were perceived by Syrians already fighting for their own causes.
Right. So basically, Salafists, international Salafists elements started to enter Syria north as well as the east from 2012 onwards. I think my dates are a bit hazy, but I think Nusra was declared either end of 2012 or beginning of 2013, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is basically the Syria branch of Al-Qaeda. It was very, very small. It used completely different methods. I mean, at the beginning they simply used car bombs as opposed the usual methods that they had used all over the world, as opposed to forming an actual battalion and fighting openly and all of that. But then soon enough, obviously they organized and they started having their own presence in different parts of the country. Now, what's so interesting about the Syrian war is that it also fractured these formidable players that people were utterly terrified of Al-Qaeda. And then Al-Qaeda was ultimately splintered as a result of the differences amongst them in Syria. We had a lot of Salafists come in. And then we realized that some of them were by and large Syrian, and they followed Al-Qaeda. And then some of them were by and large Iraqi and international, and they followed the Iraqi leadership of Al-Qaeda, which quickly evolved into ISIS. And then we had this big clash between ISIS and the Syrian battalions. Now, all of this happened obviously slowly over the period of 2013, so that by the beginning of 2014, these groups are actually openly fighting one another. But at the beginning, people were not aware. I think people on the ground obviously have war. Things are happening. Yes, I think people now looking back, and I'm not talking about people like me, for instance, liberal secularists, but even conservatives on the ground, people from small Syrian villages who were involved with the Free Syrian Army and suddenly saw people from Iraq or Saudi Arabia or Tunisia or coming and telling them that they want to help them and they want to fight the Syrian regime with them. At the beginning, people felt, oh, people want to fight with us. And then quickly enough, soon enough, people realized that, oh, they have their completely different agenda. They have their completely different priorities. They want to assert power over me as much as they want to actually get rid of Assad, in the case of Nusra, or maybe they're not interested at all in getting rid of Assad. They just want to have their own territory and establish their own rule there, such as ISIS. And so from I think 2013 onwards, people started realizing, and I'm talking here again, even Islamic battalions on the ground, obviously the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, people started distancing themselves from the Salafist jihadist elements. The big confrontation happened in Aleppo and in Idlib, when in the beginnings of 2014, and this is people often forget this, that the first people who fought ISIS were not the Syrian regime forces, but actually the Syrian rebel forces in Aleppo and in Idlib, when they expelled ISIS completely from those two provinces and pushed them to Raqqa, which then in return ISIS expelled those groups from Raqqa and established its own Islamic State there. So that was the moment of the complete and total divorce between this completely chaotic situation where you had two different elements present within the same camp, if that's the right word. Now we're witnessing something very similar between Nusra and the rest of the Islamic, the Syrian sort of like either FSA or Syrian Salafist forces like Ahrar al-Sham. Those people are interested in a political solution. They're taking part in the negotiations. They go to Astana. They do things. They at least on paper they subscribe to the Geneva the Geneva Accord as an overarching international reference point for how the Syrian solution, for how the Syrian problem will be solved. Nusra doesn't, obviously, and so they're clashing.
Okay. Karam, we have much more to talk, but there's another program starting at 4, so I have to stop here. Okay. I hope we can have you another day so that we can continue this discussion.
Absolutely.
Okay, so today our guest was Karam Nachar, and we discussed what has happened in Syria since 2011. There are a lot of subjects to talk about, and we weren't able to finish, and I hope that we can continue another day and have Karam's views on how the Syrian uprisings has evolved. Thanks for watching us.